There's enough sugar for everyone.
Oh, thank you.
My pleasure.
But no, thank you.
I'm not sure I can actually open the bag.
We got plenty of packets, so that's good.
You know, they make these things tricky now. They don't let you do the part. They don't even let you do that.
Makes it quicker.
I can't even do that.
I know.
I'm gonna
Figure that one out.
still there.
I don't have my handy dandy Leatherman with me. I could open it. I know. Oh, he did it. He did it.
Follow your instructions?
Yes, I did.
He gets two.
I did. I read it.
Thanks.
I read it while I was on the road.
Snickers?
You might need some for extra energy.
Okay.
So you're just pulling in from Ashland, huh?
Yeah, we've been home about less than an hour. Yeah.
Lord. Ashland's what, about 6-7 hour drive?
It's 5.5 if you don't stop.
Oh. When you're moving though.
Yeah, we're stopped.
So you already got started?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. And got a pretty small crew tonight, but I'll briefly go over what we're talking about. Tonight we're going to talk about two items that are somewhat related, but the first one is the Heritage Tree Code. And the Heritage Tree Code that is currently on the books was adopted in 2008. And it is within our Oregon City Municipal Code section, chapter 12.08.040. And so within that section, there's a process for designation of heritage trees on public and private property. And the process identifies, today what the process talks about is that heritage trees can be submitted for nomination on either public or private property. If a tree is submitted for nomination on private property, it has to have owner consent, and if it's on public property, it is forwarded along to the City Commission with consent of the Community Development Director. The Natural Resources Committee is not mentioned in the code because the code was adopted when the Natural Resources Committee was not currently formed. But what we've been doing is sending all the nominations to the Natural Resources Committee for a recommendation before they go to the City Commission. So today we've reviewed with the Natural Resources Committee 4 heritage trees and grove nominations. 2 of those nominations were on private property and have been all the way through the process and approved by the City Commission. One tree was nominated on public right-of-way and was denied heritage tree nomination after going through the entire process. And the 4th nomination was for an entire grove of trees on Waterboard Park and the Public Works Master Plan site as one entire heritage tree grove. And the City Commission has not reached a decision on that nomination today. So that's kind of where we are. And throughout the process, we've been looking at the code that we have in place and looking at ways to improve both the criteria for approval as well as some of the definitions in that code section. And before we move forward any further with starting revisions to that code, we wanted to talk about it with the Planning Commission's input as well. And then we also wanted to do some review of other jurisdictions' heritage tree ordinances, just to see what kind of criteria they use for designation. So in your packet, we've included 3 other jurisdictions' ordinances. The first one is Lake Oswego, and the City of Oregon City's current code is based on the Lake Oswego code. A lot of the language in there is very similar, although the review bodies and decision makers are different. The second code that we've included there is West Lynn. And the third code and process that we've included is Clackamas County. And what we've done as well is include some revisions that Richard Craven and Brian Boyce had initially started to work on this code, red line packet, and that's in your packet as well. And I'd like to thank both Richard and Eric Carr, who are here tonight, for their work to date on this, and I know that they're going to continue to be involved in this process.
I think what we realized after going through this, especially with the Waterboard Park and Public Works facility, was that there really were some definitions that really needed to be thought about again and redefined, because the way they were written, they just really weren't usable, and they didn't provide probably enough guidance. I think, speaking from what I kind of got back, and I think I'll turn over to you guys as well to kind of help raise some of the concerns, or that you saw in the code, and why we're kind of reassessing the way it's written, and how we can just make it a little bit easier to use and to make decisions when these type of applications come on. Mm-hmm. And I think one other part that probably needs to be discussed a little bit is, in our municipal code, a property owner is responsible for the street tree and the sidewalk in front of their house, even though it's in public right-of-way in many cases. And so how do we want to handle that when you've got a street tree that's in the public right-of-way? And really you need the property owner to be willing to take care and maintain that, because the city currently doesn't have an urban reforestry program, monies to maintain, upkeep, trim, limb, and everything that would go along with those type of heritage tree nominations in the public right-of-way. So you almost have street trees in the public right-of-way, you obviously have trees on private property, and then you have these other kind of groves or specimen trees in parks or open spaces outside of the public right-of-way. You almost have, we're seeing kind of three distinct categories almost. And so, Richard, you want to?
Just a question. If my memory serves me, we had a work session on this a couple months ago.
Yes.
A little, yeah. And so, yeah.
2 or 3 months ago.
Right.
So is this kind of building on what we talked about at that last meeting?
Yeah. Well, today staff has not produced any edits to this code yet. We will do that, but before we do, we want to make sure that some of these other codes are considered.
Okay. The reason I asked is
Yeah.
I'm in the process of moving, so I couldn't find my notebook to bring with me.
Yeah.
But I know we had a really extensive discussion about it whenever we met a couple, 2 or 3 months ago. And I remember there were some specific definitions that we had talked about at length that the Heritage or the Natural Resource Committee was going to come back to us with recommended language for those things.
Okay.
Excuse me just a second. I'm Richard Craven.
Yes.
Did you have that before? Does that look familiar? It's in the packet here, but this is red line.
I don't know if we brought the red lines the last time.
Well, I mean,
we met.
is that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's in the
Yes,
packet.
so we included
That's
that
what
this
we
time
had
around.
last time, is that
Right.
right?
Yeah.
This is what we talked about. I can't remember exactly
what the colors were.
when this came into being.
Yeah, no, that's what we talked about last time.
Okay, all right.
I looked and I could not find it.
Yeah.
I'm living out of boxes right now. We're only a week and a half into moving into this new house. It's like, you can't find anything.
I think Jerry's apparently wasn't able to be here tonight. I'm not sure where Brian is. I thought he was going to be here actually. But did you hear from?
I haven't heard from either of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, well, I've got just 2 or 3 things I think of course, the language in the code needs to be clear so that it's really obvious what is being asked or talked about here. And we felt, of course, that certain parts are not real obvious, or not clear, or it leads you to wonder, why did they do that? What is a grove, for example? Things like that. But I think, we all agree that something needs to happen to the language, and I think that's what we talked about last time for the most part. But there also needs to be a strong staff analysis when an application comes in, and that was really apparent on the Waterboard Park field, because in that analysis, there was not exactly a recommendation made. There wasn't, it kind of left you like, okay, what do you really think about it? And so I noticed on the next one that came in, there was a really strong analysis, and it was very good, I thought, and it led us in whatever way we wanted to go, basically. But there was good information there to form, for us to form an analysis. And so, but also, like on Waterboard Park and that other public works area, those were combined applications, and it didn't seem like they should be combined like that to me, because it just, to me, it just confused the issue. Are we on the record tonight? Or we are on the record?
Yeah.
I'm
Okay.
writing down everything you say so I can report back to the neighborhood association.
Yeah. I mean, are we being recorded or what?
Yeah, it's recorded,
Okay.
yeah.
Just curious. But in any event, it seemed like there were certain politics that kind of got involved in that. And I just didn't think that was any place for us on the Natural Resource Committee to be considering politics, because we're there to look at, as I understand it, to look at a technical analysis, what do we think based on our backgrounds, and how can we make a decision that's consistent with whatever the code is. And so I didn't appreciate some public comments, basically, that were political in nature. And I understand that everybody's right to make those, but it just didn't, I don't feel, it didn't help us, in our analysis. It just wasn't.
I
useful.
wasn't there, so, and I don't generally watch the tapes.
Okay.
So I'll ask you off the record so that you don't have to say anything on there, because
Well-
I kind of think I know what you're talking about, but I want to be perfectly clear. I'm not here.
Sure, but it's just, political statements. I mean, I can't deal with political statements on a committee like that, and I'm not sure anybody else can, except to listen, and, okay.
Well, it's
But
your job to review it on the merits, basically.
That's exactly what I'm trying to say, yeah, exactly.
No, I think you bring up a good point, I really do.
Yeah,
And that's been the issue in planning and land use, and environmental planning, since dirt was invented.
okay,
Technical versus political,
Well,
and
and
a
I-
separation of the two.
yeah,
I think the thing that you had said last time, I thought was really kind of, you boiled it down to the essence of the issues, that you needed the code to be written in a way that you could make objective decisions based on what the code said, and it was not a subjective kind of a thing, well, how do you define that?
yes,
So the definitions were really important to be clear, so that it wasn't open to political debate,
Mhm.
because you could just say, well, that qualifies. And as I recall last time, the biggest difficulty you were having was having an objective definition of the term grove,
yeah,
what constituted a grove.
And I guess, in trying to administer it from the staff side, you begin to wonder if grove is even appropriate, because it starts to get into habitat and understory, and that's kind of a different conversation, I think, than the original intent of the heritage tree.
Right.
We kind of stuck grove in there.
Yes.
We have this, 20-foot on, trying to define a grove with measurements is
Yeah,
difficult.
it's almost
So-
as if somebody decided to piggyback on one idea, another idea that seemed like it was kind of related to that same idea, but it's really a different thing.
Right, I
And I-
agree. I think it starts to get into just clarifying what the intent of the heritage tree grove or code is. Is it historical values? Once you start getting into ecological values,
It's almost a different.
Yeah, I think it's
animal.
asking too much of the code itself, but also really too much of the NRC to try to wade through that and separate the two. And I would like to see it kind of refocus back towards
Significant tree.
significant tree, the historical elements, things like that.
Yeah, I would second that, as they say. I feel the same way. However, we're not speaking here for, on a consensus basis for the Natural Resource Committee. We're here as individuals representing the Natural Resource Committee, but we haven't really discussed in detail what we all think.
Yeah, how we should move this forward.
Okay, so
what needs
just to
be
make
changed.
sure that you understand that part. But yes, I think it should be more directed towards the historical side of things, not the ecological. The ecological is handled in other ways. And I would, I heard Eric mention this the other night at the Natural Resource Committee, so I think that's, a good way to look at it.
When you say heritage tree, you're talking singular, don't you?
Not necessarily,
Well, then why do we use the word tree?
because right now we use the word tree or grove, and
Yeah.
nobody knows what a grove is
Well,
exactly.
that's where the complication comes in.
I think it's just tree or
Yeah.
trees,
Tree or trees?
yes, to me. It's,
Well, if my memory serves, last time we had talked about the idea of just eliminating the term grove from code and specifically identifying a tree or trees that qualified as heritage trees.
Yes.
And I remember we
Yes.
kind of talked about this one particular paragraph,
which one is it?
1704, it's on page 4 or 5, 1704, 1355. And it looks like somebody has struck out the word grove from that paragraph, but then it doesn't carry it down to the next paragraph. And I think we had actually talked about eliminating the next paragraph and just letting the previous paragraph stand on its own.
I'm sorry, that's page
It's page 4 or 5.
Yeah, I think that was probably just left in by chance.
But I do remember we had some discussion
Yeah.
about taking that one paragraph, the 1365 paragraph out and letting the previous paragraph stand on its own.
So improving the definition of it.
And I think refocusing it back to focusing on the tree rather than habitat understory.
Yeah, and the heritage aspect of the tree as opposed to the environment
Yeah.
of the
I
area
like
where
that.
the tree's at. Because then you get into the whole issue of, is it a wetlands, is it a, whatever other environment.
Type of habitat it could be.
Yeah, it can be a different habitat completely.
So one of the potential edits that had been suggested was to, if you were going to keep the definition of a grove, there would be an improvement of the definition by talking about mutual canopy cover. But what we're saying is that we would not include that definition at all. We would just go with individual tree
It says that a
nomination.
grove is a group of trees, according to Webster's dictionary.
Right.
And I think I don't have any issue with the word grove as long as you put in a definition of what it is.
Yeah.
I mean, that, like I said, it took me 2 seconds to look it up, so.
But where you run into issues is if you try and say, I'm going to designate these 50 trees as a grove.
Well, they kind of all have to be together. They can't be one here and one there. And
But
that's not a-
does that start to defeat the purpose of the heritage tree nomination? I think that's what we struggled with a little bit. What happens if out of that 50, 10 of them meet the minimum size requirements based on species and the other 40 don't? What do you do there? Should each, I think that's kind of what we struggled with.
For a group of trees that is growing naturally.
And, it really becomes difficult because most of these are going to be submitted by citizens. How much work do you, in expense, in order to have the information that we need, do you put on them to document tree canopy, tree size, site plan, you know, and if they don't provide it, it falls on staff. And we don't necessarily have that information anywhere. You know, we don't have a citywide tree inventory to be able to say even species size or whatnot. And so I think that was part of the problem too, is what do you do in this situation when you know you've got, you know, they might be beautiful trees, but they're covered in ivy, you've got some dead, you've got some hazardous conditions. What do you do in that situation? Is that really what we wanted this code to do? Is it highlighting great species now, or species that could be at some point if they were properly maintained by some unidentified, unfunded group?
Well, one of the things, and I kind of, in my mind, going back to the last discussion we had on this, is that this is different than tree preservation. We have tree preservation regulations for trees in general. This is specific to historic trees, or trees that have a historic value to them. So this would be a tree that has been at that location for, 150 years or 200 years, and it has a relevance to, heritage to the pioneers or the Indian tribes that lived here or whatever, but there's some significance to it other than just, you want to say trees.
Right, but under the criteria, the tree or grove is of landmark importance to the city of Oregon City due to its age, size, species, horticultural, or ecological quality or historic significance. So
Right.
ecological quality is presently in here, so it's not just solely historic.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
and that's what I think Eric is focusing on,
Yeah.
and I would tend to agree.
Yeah, I think that adding ecological, that one word really muddies
The decision.
what the intent is. Again,
Which
it's like-
paragraph said?
Should go D1A.
I'm looking at the
Should
original.
be page 2.
Yeah, I'm looking at D, which is criteria 1, and then it goes to A. It says a tree or grove is
Yeah.
of landmark
Bottom third of the
importance.
page.
Page
It's
2 of
highlighted
5.
there.
Under DA.
Well, some, I'm not a tree person. I mean, I know enough about trees to be dangerous, but there are some species that do tend to grow together. I mean, you see one, oaks, for instance, are one of those species that you might have a lone one out there, but to begin with, there probably were lots of them, and they probably all came from the same one. Sometimes firs are that way. My in-laws have some heritage firs on their Century Farm, and there's more than one. I mean, they're huge. They're big trees, and I don't know if they were planted there that way or whether they were there, but they're old, and all of them were. The 3 or 4 of them that are kind of there together, they were all considered.
Well, I think there's certain species of trees that don't do well as an individual. You can have an oak out in the middle of the field and it'll just do fine, but if you have a single fir tree out in the middle of the field,
It doesn't.
eventually it's going to blow over by
Or get
itself.
struck by lightning.
Yes, or, and I guess the ecological part and the addition of the multiple tree factor is what seems like it's confusing this whole code. It would be much simpler if you could identify a tree. And to me, it seems like in order for a group of trees to qualify, that group of trees, probably by its nature, needs to be a small group that has some relevance to each other. It's not just somebody's Christmas tree farm that got really big.
Yeah.
No, those are pretty obvious that, that was planted and they let it go. I wasn't speaking of something, like that. But I think there's a way that, I think with anything else, just like any code, you have a definition. And you define what it is that you mean, and you put it in there. And reasonable people should generally agree there's always going to be some person who's not going to agree, and they're going to come up with their version of it, but I would say the majority is going to look at it and go, okay, this is what we all meant. So, I mean, you have any citizen may recommend, well, I don't know if you meant a tree or a tree. So any citizen may recommend tree, and then you have trees to be designated as a heritage tree, or, I don't know, I guess you'd have to put it best after everything if you're talking about more than one. You want to include more than one or one.
For comparison's sake, the West Lynn Code, which I admittedly have not really reviewed in much detail yet, provides for a point value for criteria that includes whether it is, what the circumference is, whether it's rapidly growing, moderately growing, or slow growing, a point value for location, a point value for condition, a point value for historical factor.
I didn't understand their point value for location. That makes
Yeah.
absolutely no sense to me.
Well, I can
you
see
get six-
kind of-
You get 6 points if it's in a commercial area, I mean, where it would definitely be subject to a lot of stress and strain.
Yeah, and less points if it's in a,
Forested area, and I wrote next to that, I put why.
Yeah. If it was,
For the trees.
if it was a magnificent, redwood tree by, in a clearing in a forested area, it shouldn't be penalized just because it's not in.
In a
In a commercial area, yes.
That doesn't make sense.
but I think this is an attempt to try to make the analysis a little more objective, which, how it works in practice, I don't know.
Well, this,
Yeah.
I think that what is good about this idea is that you're making it more objective, and you're creating some standards to measure to.
What's the difference between somewhat significant and marginally
The
significant?
problem when you start applying values to it is exactly what Denise was saying. What makes a heritage tree more important just because it's in a commercial area versus in somebody's private yard?
Well, and I think also, because this is so subjective, I think that kind of focusing back on the purpose statement and providing clear direction there of what the intent is. Maybe like, would we ever consider, nominate, a tree that has been topped will not be considered, if there's, things that can kind of clarify what we're really trying to do, I think would help with implementing the approval criteria. Because, as you see, there's multiple ways to slice this, but in every case, it's still going to be very subjective.
Right.
I think I was trying to figure out what the city of West Lynn, how they define heritage tree, and I found, it's over on the next page.
Yeah, I didn't really see it
It's over on the
clearly defined.
historical factor to determine, and so forth. If you can find it there, it's not.
Well, they're saying that's that criteria.
Yeah,
That's the same criteria used to designate a place or a building or a site, or, if it's associated with historic or, famous events, cultural history of state, community, or a person or persons who make, so if it's Paul Revere's tree,
yeah. Is that what you're trying to say, though, basically?
To an extent, but I think the Oregon Heritage Tree Program, which is run by Oregon Travel Experience, I guess, which is kind of a quasi-state government, they've got definition, and they've got 4 points on it. One is that the tree is associated with events that had a significant contribution to our history. Next one is associated with a life or a person, or next is represents a significant and distinguishable entity within the community. And then lastly, age, size, or species significance. Again, and they start off, by describing it as a way to just increase public awareness about the contribution of trees. What is, so again, back to the first question is why have a heritage tree program? And I think simply it's just to celebrate nice, great trees in your city, you know, and it
The
doesn't
history
need
of
to
that
be,
particular tree.
yeah, it doesn't need to be incredibly complex and get down into, you know, a grove is 75% continuous canopy. You know, I think this just is getting beyond the intent of what the program's about. You know, if you want to get into more tree protections, you mentioned there are tree protections through, you know, tree code. You can revise those if, you know, you want to enhance that. But I think just as a tool to celebrate trees, you know, keep it simple.
Can I make copies of that?
Yes.
Well, Tony said something that I think is also worthy, I think, of incorporating into the criteria is that it's kind of like what things cancel it out from being considered as a heritage tree. Has the tree been damaged or significantly altered or pruned or whatever to the point where it disqualifies it from being a heritage tree? If it's diseased or, you know, whatever, there's probably some criteria that you could use that an arborist would agree, you know, be able to look at it and say, no, that doesn't, it doesn't meet the minimum standard for quality of a heritage tree.
See, I wouldn't put that kind of a qualifier on it, I don't think. For example, let's just say you're standing at Kenema and there's a dead tree. It's been dead for 50 years, but you know, based on historical evidence, that that was the tree that Chief whatever, you know, or that was the gathering site of Native American tribes, peoples, at that site for some historic event. You
That's
know,
a good point.
but yet the ice diseased, it's dead, it's probably maybe going to disappear sometime unless it's somehow preserved, but yet there it is, you know. And to me, I would like to see something like that preserved, you
That's a good
know.
point.
You know,
Even
just
like in Gladstone where the powwow tree, allegedly, I guess it's not really there anymore. But there is a plaque.
Yeah,
And
I think-
we have Abernathy's elm, which unfortunately ODOT cut down. The stump is still there, and there's a plaque next to it.
Oh.
Yeah, I think, you know,
Okay.
Oregon Field Guide did a recent episode where they tracked down supposedly the oldest tree in the state out in eastern Oregon. And looking at that thing, it looks dead, but it's thousands of years old.
Mm.
So,
Right.
yeah, I guess that is, you know,
So
Yeah.
that's a good point. It's a very good point.
Did they ever protect that tree? Is that protected?
they protected it, I think, by not disclosing the location of it.
That's what they do when they figure out where the tallest tree is, and they go climb it and measure it. They don't tell anybody where
Oh,
it
really?
is.
But
Yeah.
we got it.
It's somewhere.
I'm not sure, I think I asked Peter at one point in time to try to figure out what the so-called legislative history on this is, but I don't think you could find anything on it.
On ours?
Yeah.
On the one that we.
Yeah. But I don't know exactly why ecological quality was put into this. But let's just assume for a second that you took ecological quality out of it. How is ecological quality protected for trees or heritage groves or whatever?
Well, I guess that gets into the bigger question of what the intent is here.
Yeah.
You know, because we don't have a tree protection code in Oregon City, right? And when we went through and did Title III, looking at riparian corridors, and there was a big discussion about upland habitat and whether we're going to protect that or not. And the decision was made that we wouldn't, that we would focus back on our riparian areas and concentrate there, rather than adopting another overlay that was more dealing with kind of what we're talking about here, trees and habitat and ecological value, when it's, you know, potentially developable area, you run into that issue. So, you know, that's where I think getting back to the purpose of trying to get some agreement on what are we really trying to do here? Are we, you know, because it seemed like it's kind of morphing a little bit into an ecological question of tree communities and vegetative communities rather than a heritage tree specimen program. And that's where it gets difficult, because I know that there's a lot of interest in protecting upland groves and upland habitat, but we don't, you almost have to do that through a regulatory method with I think, land use, rather than trying to do it through this, because I don't know that was the intent of this, or there's a different process to do that, because I think it really does make it difficult to implement, because you're having a lot of discussion that's ignoring the trees and saying, oh, look at all this great understory you have, look at this understory community that you have, and was that what we were trying to do? And I know when we wrote it, that wasn't the intent, and why ecological got in there is probably because it was a cut and paste, and we, in hindsight.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the Lake Oswego code, it's the same language, so it was a cut and paste.
Well, they use road in this. You talk about a tree or group of trees.
Right.
I don't have any problem if we say tree or group of trees.
Yeah.
And it gets down to,
Yeah, they say stand of trees, I mean, that's kind of group of trees.
But I think I like what you were talking about, that even a dead tree could qualify if you could identify a historical
Yeah.
significance to it, that either a person or an event happened at that location, and the tree was relevant to that. It was a landmark, and I could see, if you could demonstrate that a tree was a landmark for the pioneers, that they knew that was the way to go, so to speak, on their trail. I know when I've gone hiking in the woods, and you'd see a particular formation or a tree or something, you'd use that as almost like your compass. And I can see if there are trees that have that kind of significance in this area, it'd be nice to give them that recognition.
Yeah.
The other aspects of this in terms of processing are, a couple of these codes absolutely require an arborist report be supplied at somebody's expense. It doesn't say who. If it's on private property, ostensibly that would be private property owner's obligation, but that is a significant part of the analysis, because it can tell you a number of things. It can tell you whether or not there's an existing disease or condition of the tree which is either treatable or not treatable, or at a certain expense. And currently, we don't have any requirement for that, although it's a useful factor in a couple of the last ones that we've reviewed. Actually, the last one. The other thing that we haven't considered in our criteria is whether there's good public access to view the tree, which is, I think, one of the heritage nomination forms criteria. So that's certainly a consideration.
Yeah, we had an example from one of the, he used to be one of the chief arborists for the city of Portland. He came in and talked to us a little bit about the tree program and the tree code and whatnot. I guess there was this, I forget what type it was, a big, beautiful tree in Portland, and it was down, you had the right-of-way, and the house was up a little bit. So you had this huge house, and then it fell off the back. And he's like, from the road, you could maybe see like the top 10 feet of it. So they actually didn't nominate it because part of their approval criteria was for the education and outreach component was that it was visible for the general public to be able to see and understand and appreciate what they were protecting.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And I could see where you could write, in your application form or the owner's application form, if they're the consenting party, they could grant an easement potentially at their own volition to view that.
I think the other difference there is that they had a tree maintenance fund and department and arborists, and they actually took care of maintaining and protecting the tree and making sure it was healthy. So we're kind of trying to do this without the funds to do it. We're really relying on the property owner to step up and take on that responsibility.
Boy, that's where I draw the line, guys. I mean, there's people here $20 bills, half a tank of gas. And we're asking the public to maintain a tree that they can't afford to maintain. Nominated by somebody else that thought it was a good tree to nominate. And the poor property owner is kind of, he didn't initiate it. How are you going to justify that to him?
Well, they would have to. And the way we're set up is that if it's on private property, the property owner needs to sign. We will not nominate on private property.
You won't.
Right.
We will
No.
not. No, it has to be property owner initiated. So
Well, I misunderstood then. I thought anybody could.
on public, and I think that's one thing, and I think that's one area where we need to clarify, kind of,
Yeah,
we have the
that's-
private property.
Yeah.
I think the one where we need to clarify are street trees in front of someone's home, because they are the ones responsible to maintain that. And to me, kind of like that Polk one, where the property owner who is responsible should probably be required to sign the application, so that I couldn't go, you have a beautiful tree in front of your house.
Yeah, and you don't like
and-
it.
And I nominate it, I think it just raises an issue there.
Yes, it does.
If we don't have the funds to do it in the public right of way, then the adjacent property owner should probably be a willing participant, and we won't even accept it otherwise. I think I took that away from the Polk one, because the property owner's like, look, it's damaging my house, it's damaging my cars, I don't want to maintain it. And it's kind of
So there goes the application.
it's something we need to discuss, because I don't think we ever envisioned that a neighbor would nominate a tree in front of someone else's property.
Yeah,
Okay.
because what that situation was, you had the street here, you had a 12-foot wide alley. The tree was right in the alley on the property line almost, probably because a squirrel ran down the fence at some point and dropped a walnut. But it's been growing, and no one ever removed it, and it grew and it grew, and then it was topped by the owner twice, and at about 20 and 30 feet, and it kept growing from that point. And now it's a huge tree, and it's in beautiful shape, but 5 years from now, some of those limbs that sprouted out potentially could be pretty heavy. So this tree,
So the property owner really
He-
ended up causing their own problem.
he applied for a street tree removal permit, and the owner across the street nominated it for a heritage tree on the same day.
Oh. Well, that's just a coincidence.
That's a coincidence.
Of course it
Only at
was.
City Hall.
It wasn't a coincidence.
What happened to that then? We agreed that it shouldn't be a heritage tree.
And that, that one
What
was,
happens now?
yeah, we got it, we did the analysis, we made the recommendation to you.
Mhm.
You agreed with the recommendation, we went to the city commission, they agreed with the NRC's recommendation. The tree is not a designated tree, but it gets processed as a public street tree, healthy condition, and the number of mitigation trees required in the code is 8.
Yeah.
So.
Now, see,
yeah.
as I mentioned to you before, I have a little problem with that.
Yeah.
Because it's sitting in an alley,
Right.
and the guy, his family, the family there is going to be penalized for taking the tree down, And it just doesn't seem like that should happen that way. I mean, the tree is sitting in the alley in the public right-of-way where it never should have been in the first place.
But,
You-
yeah, and the definition of a public tree in the code includes trees growing in an alley. So.
In the right-of-way.
In the right of way.
Yeah, well, see, there's something wrong with that, just philosophically, from my view.
And that's a tough one, because the flip side is, like City of Portland, they will not let you take out a street tree, even though it's on your nickel, and you've got to mitigate it
Yeah.
if it's not an imminent hazard,
Yeah.
imminent threat. So in this, what we kind of got is kind of this, if it's healthy and you want to take it out, we can't stop you. The only way we can is to say you got to put 8 trees back, So you could be, we get a lot of calls of, I don't like this tree, I want to cut it down. Nothing wrong with it.
Because they arbitrarily don't like it.
Right, it's too big, too many leaves, whatever.
It's not-
We've heard them all.
It's not a
But-
hazard, it's just a nuisance.
Right.
To them.
Yeah.
And so we're kind of walking, we don't say you can't take it out because it's not a danger. But we don't say, oh yeah, go ahead and cut it down and just put 1 back or none back, So It is, it's a tough one to be in, just because we don't have the resources to
Yeah, but
maintain.
in that kind of a situation, it just seems to me that that tree was probably not planted by anybody.
Right.
Like you said, maybe
In a
it's
planter
square foot
strip
or
or-
acre or
right.
whatever, you know. And there it is, sitting in the right of way where it never should be, but yet the property owner is being penalized.
Well, it's not on his property, so how is he being penalized?
Because he has to do the mitigation.
Yeah,
trees.
But he wants to cut it down.
Right, but it's not, you know, it's potentially causing damage to his property. It's just something
Well,
that
that's,
don't feel right. you
We
know.
don't know that.
we're getting a little off track here because the subject is this heritage tree.
Right, we're getting into property rights and.
And,
I
yeah,
don't
now
wanna
we're
do
getting
it.
into property rights and tree protection and all that stuff, which, even though I think it has a lot of merit, this particular little document that you handed out, I think is great. The 4 points that are listed there, I think could easily be incorporated into the city definition of what it takes to qualify as a heritage tree. And none of those necessarily are the environmental aspect of the tree. Yeah, I think the language here is a lot less ambiguous, and you can kind of go with those as, I think, a little bit more objective ways of measuring if a tree qualifies or not.
I think we have some direction on trying to maybe refocus the purpose, have that discussion with Natural Resources Committee and start to rework this so that it does become a little manageable based on our experiences and trying to implement it.
I think simple, simple, simple.
The one thing I like about these 4 criteria is it does get away from that ecological aspect. And
Yeah.
it just focuses on the tree itself or the group of trees. And, it eliminates the term grove, which is kind of ambiguous. And so you've got a tree or a group of trees that meet those 4 criteria.
Well, it says it must meet one. It doesn't say it has to be
One,
all of them,
right.
because I don't know if you could do that.
Yeah, find one that hits all those things.
Yeah, you might,
But I think, to me, that would be a really great starting point for establishing the definition of what it takes to qualify as a heritage tree, and clean up some of the language we've got in our current code to take out the ambiguous language and just make it a lot more clear.
I guess to build on that, because we had also heard that the statement within the criteria for having, ecological quality. I mean, if we were to remove that from the criteria in the code, I think we would get some pushback from people who feel that it's justified as a criterion for heritage tree designation.
well, as long as they can provide the documentation.
Right.
Well, I guess my
And if they want
response to
to
that
do
is,
that, then I don't have any issue with that.
my response to that really is tree protection ought to be a separate issue from heritage tree designation. And if people want to protect trees because they have an ecological value, then I think that ought to be a separate issue.
So you don't see designating a heritage tree as protecting it?
No, I do, but it's a different level of protection. You're designating it with a historical designation. I think tree protection,
It's a heritage tree designation. It's talking about the heritage of the tree. It may
Right.
have some historical significance, but it isn't the only thing
right,
that's
but
going on.
it's the historic value of the tree is not dependent on its ecological
But it could be.
surroundings.
I mean, I see this as designating it, i.e. protecting it. I mean, I think it protects, that you're actually putting some level of protection on it by designating it as a heritage tree.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. I think the protection goes with the designation of it. But there's, I think, a separate category of tree protection that it would deal with trees like what we're talking about, the example that you had there. That tree is not a historical tree, but doesn't qualify for tree protection.
Yeah, I think that's the difficult part, is trying to identify what the intent of what we're trying to do here. Because I think that, you could, I think, someone could probably make a pretty good case in many, instances. If you have a grove of trees, there's obviously ecological value associated with having that grove of trees.
Yes.
Even though none of the trees may be of species or size or historical significance.
Right.
I mean, so.
And that's why I think it's really a separate issue. You could build a really good case that this group of trees ought to be protected because it provides ecological value. It's part of a wetland, or it's part of a forest, or a park, or something like that. And maybe it's not historic at all. But it seems like that's separate from saying this particular tree or group of trees has a historic significance that qualifies it for that heritage designation.
Well, let's say you have a stand group of trees that have actually no historic significance whatsoever, but they have great ecological significance.
So we
So what do you do with that?
We could have a separate designation for tree protection of significant trees that are not historic value. But that's where I see this ordinance is kind of getting muddy, because you're really not saying that this tree is dependent on its ecology, it's dependent on its historic value.
You can make the argument that really any tree or any group of trees has ecological value. So going back to the intent, is, to me, I see it as the primary intent of a heritage tree is celebrate the trees, educate the community about the trees, with the underlying that yes, it does provide some protection for that tree, but the primary thrust of it should be just to celebrate and educate those trees.
Right.
Yeah.
And I do think that there may be a justification for having a separate tree protection ordinance, or whatever you want to designate it as, that's independent from the historic tree ordinance. But I think exactly what you just said is that's kind of the underlying purpose of the historic tree, is that this tree, whether or not its ecology is important or not, it has a significance to it. And maybe it's the dead tree that the tribe used as their ceremonial centerpiece.
Well, if you look at our minutes, it said the Natural Resources Committee reviewed their list of recommended changes, including definitions of rare and grove. So obviously, since we looked at this in June, you now don't want to do that.
Well, we don't
Let me
have all
respond to
of
that
it.
first, I think.
Well, I'm just saying that's what it said in our notes. That's
Okay, now, keeping in mind, there's 2 people here out of 7.
Sure.
We have not really discussed this in any detail in the Natural Resource Committee.
Since we had our meeting in June?
Yes.
Okay.
And we are not here advocating for the whole committee, for you to do something. We're discussing things in here that don't seem consistent, or things that we might want to see changed. But if we have our whenever we have our next meeting, it may be that the committee decides that they do want to leave ecological in here. That could come back to you as a recommendation. It would not be my choice, and for the reasons that Eric brought up. And I think I would like to see it a little cleaner than that. But at the same time, it seems to me ecological quality needs to be protected somehow, so that's why I was asking, how is it protected? How would it be protected?
And that's just, like I said, that's something where we focus on through our regulatory process, through the land use submittals for subdivision, site plan, design review, partitions, where we've focused on riparian corridors and riparian habitat as the areas. So we don't get into upland habitat protection and restoration.
Subdivisions is where they have the greatest impact,
Yeah.
removing the greatest amount of trees.
And the way we've done that is through focusing on the tree.
Yeah.
So if you've got a tree, we get back into, we have bonuses, we have density bonuses and reduced setbacks and reduced lot sizes for protection of groups of trees. And because we didn't want to get into, looking at habitat and looking at ecological pluses and minuses on every property. You could focus on the tree. If it's X inches in diameter and X feet off the ground, you know what it's worth in terms of mitigation or protection. And so we did that through incentives for preservation and then mitigation if removed. So that's kind of where we're at. So we don't, if it's upland, if it's out of a wetland, we don't get an assessment of the actual habitat. We get an assessment of the trees. Whereas if you were putting a road through over a stream, okay, let's say it's a perennial stream, so you've got a 50-foot buffer on either side of that. So if you put a road through there, because it was the only way to access it, we would then get into a biological assessment of the corridor. We'd be into a replacement scenario, a mitigation scenario for the width of the right-of-way through there. So if you put in let's say we did a reduced street at 40-foot right-of-way, there'd be mitigation associated with that in terms of adding a vegetated corridor around the stream and pulling exotics, replanting that vegetated corridor. So that's where our focus is, and that's where you get the detailed biological assessment of the existing condition.
So,
And then the other ordinance that is not in place today is an ordinance that regulates all trees on private property within, completely outside of a land use process, where you say all trees over a certain diameter at breast height are protected hereby, with a few exceptions. Like in Portland, I hear this is changing, but up until the ordinance changes, you can remove trees on a single-family lot that's not in an overlay district and it's not subject to redevelopment without a permit. But I gather that that's changing, so that even if you're on a single-family lot and you want to remove a tree,
Then go to a permit
you're
system.
going to go to a permit system. And then you're looking at something like Gresham has, which is a type 1 review, type 2 review, which is public notice and comment, and then type 3 review, where you're talking to the discretionary decision-making body because you're wanting to do something that requires that level of discretion. And in Gresham, obviously, you've got your planning staff working on that, but you also have other staff involved in it as well, such as a forester and a code enforcement person as well.
so what's the plan?
So,
Are they going to go back to their committee, do some proposed language, and then come back?
Well,
with
the plan would, I think what needs to fall to staff now is to draft some language and
the-
take
Okay,
it
so
back.
staff would
Yeah.
draft some language.
Yeah, because we've been talking about it for a while, but before we really wanted to craft the language, we wanted to get a final look at some of these ordinances.
Shows you how much time goes by and it just whizzes by. I didn't realize it's clear back to
Gee,
June.
we're having fun.
That's
I
amazing.
know, yeah,
My whole summer just got
yeah,
just like that.
yeah.
So, and I think, and I guess maybe we could try and find, off the top of my head, I can't think of a jurisdiction that regulates upland habitat in the metro region. To have that discussion may be helpful to try and, split these two apart or say, look, because I tend to agree, it really feels like we're cramming a lot into an ordinance that was intended for one specific purpose. You know, we're trying to make it catch-all as much as we can.
Be an umbrella.
Yep, and I'm not sure if it can really function that way, especially outside of the land use process itself. Because this isn't a land use decision, what we do. And so that would really get into regulating private property.
Which we already do.
I agree. I'm just saying, you know, there's not too many upland habitat codes that I can think of.
Well, and the other thing that's a little bit of a distinction with this heritage tree deal is that it's a voluntary adoption. So people are nominating trees for it, where the tree protection would be actually something that's imposed.
Regulatory.
Correct.
And so it really, I don't think mixing those together is necessarily a good thing. What makes sense to me is that you've got this very distinct heritage tree recognition, that you're saying this is a significant tree, we want to recognize it, provide a certain level of protection, education, maybe some signage or whatever is necessary to celebrate that this is a special tree.
I agree, and I think I do appreciate that, and maybe that should be right at the beginning. You know, what we're trying to do here is education and celebration of specific trees, and build on that.
Doesn't it say that?
Probably not as well as it could, I think.
It
Well,
says is to recognize, foster appreciation, and provide for voluntary protection of heritage trees.
And then build on that in terms of making it simpler, making it a little bit more clear, and kind of really trying to define so that we get out of these muddy areas.
Yep. Well, I appreciate what Eric brought, this heritage tree program document. Really, I think it helps define that, what qualifies as a heritage tree a lot better.
It's very easy to get strangled on words.
Well, you know, whether we like it or not, what happens on public and private property does affect other people. And I know that there are folks out there who don't believe in any regulation, and they're still under the misconception that we can do whatever we want on our own private property, but I think that's no longer the case. And I think in some cases, the public benefit outweighs the private, you know, need in certain circumstances. I'm not saying what those are, but, you know, we are a group of people who are governed by a set of laws and regulations. We're not out there lawless running amok. So I think what you guys need to do is that, I think maybe this meeting might have been a little premature, and that maybe you guys need to, since you haven't talked about this, is you need to talk that out before the staff actually sits down and starts writing something, get your thoughts together more, and then that'll give them something to go on to craft something. That way you're being a little more proactive, they'll react to what you're suggesting, and then you can come back and look at some sort of ordinance.
I think what I'd like to see is, based on what we've discussed here tonight, the staff come back with some possible recommendations on changes in language. You know, either this or that, or, you know,
Please give us
Mix
a
your
good place
match.
to start from.
yeah, you gotta start from
I
someplace.
mean, we've
I'm
heard.
trying to spare the staff from doing extra work before you guys have talked
Well,
this out.
I guess from my standpoint, as the community development director, you know, and as you were saying, you know, we do have regulations in place, but the intent of this was voluntary. It wasn't meant as a regulatory tool. And so I think we have to have that conversation and say, look, the regulatory aspect that you want to implement, which is great in another, but it's a different discussion. You know, we need to, I think, refocus back to the voluntary aspect of this and what the intent of it was. And so that's why, you know, I'm going to push back a little bit in terms of the upland habitat and ecological, because, you know, in a voluntary basis of where you're trying to incentivize private property owners to come in and do this, you know, that just makes it really difficult. It's so fuzzy. I mean, you know, we had 3 different arborist reports on one stinking tree, you know, on that Polk one.
Yeah, I was gonna say, there are dueling arborists.
Right, and you'll have the same thing with ecological habitat and quality.
Somebody will say it isn't, somebody will say it is.
We're
So-
calling dueling arborist plus a Solomon arborist.
Oh, that's the one that's gonna cut the baby.
Pretty much.
So I guess that's why I think it'd be good for us to maybe try and take a whack at,
Go with
based on
it.
what we've heard, to try and redefine it a
That's
little bit.
what I view our role on NRC is advisory, not rewriting passages of code.
Right.
There's
So we
one-
try and take you, what you've given us, and we'll get you 90% of the way.
I'm not sure you want to use the term taking a whack.
With regard to trees,
Yeah.
There's one other specific question that I had, and it's with respect to the diagram that I showed, because today what the code says is that abutting property owners shall be responsible for trees in the public right-of-way abutting their property. So that means public right-of-way, as well as the actual street. So the alleyway as well. And so what we ended up here with the heritage tree that was on Polk was, if the tree on public land is designated as a heritage tree, the owner, in that case, is responsible, the abutting owner is responsible for its care, yet has no interest in preserving it whatsoever. And that's what we don't want to end up doing again.
Well, and I think that's where we talk about if the budding property owner needs to be a signatory, even if it's a public.
So
street.
there's a potential, yeah, so the abutting property owner could be the signatory to the application.
Until we get into a situation where the city could take that over.
would you ever have a situation, let's say, for instance, I mean, let's just face it, some people just don't like trees, no matter what. And if somebody else wanted to be responsible for it, if they were abutting, if it's in the public right of way.
Yeah.
I mean, they could see,
Yeah.
I could see myself I could sign something saying, yes, as long as I'm here or whatever, I'm gonna be responsible for dealing with this, and
Yeah.
I guess it makes me a little uncomfortable knowing that, like, right, wrong, or indifferent, and, whatever happened with this tree at Polk, however many times
I'm
it
just
was
saying
topped.
some generic tree, I'm not saying.
I guess, but there are certain impacts to a property owner that someone who doesn't have to live with that every day doesn't have to deal with. If there's real legitimate property damage going on, you'd hate to be in a situation where, oh, yeah, I don't mind if, I don't care if it's falling on your new roof. I mean, I'm not worried about the liability, the tree's not gonna
Yeah.
fall. I mean, there's peace of mind, there's perceived hazards, there's perceived,
There is.
and that gets really difficult, I think. And then what happens if you move, or they pruned it and caused something to fail? I mean, there's a lot of liability concerns there.
From an arborist perspective, I'm a certified arborist, and certified in tree risk assessor certification. That whole process is really about putting value on the target. And I can see, if that tree is overhanging your house, you're going to have more value of that target than possibly somebody else. So that's why I see that getting fuzzy very.
Yeah, especially if
I'm
it's.
just throwing it out there.
No, I don't. No, and I don't disagree. It's just I can see. I hear the other side of that too. Of okay, city, you won't let me take it down. That limb falls on my house. I'm going to come sue you. And then who else gets wrapped up in that? If you're taking care of the tree, do I come after you? And your arborist didn't prune it correctly, or I mean,
That's at 7th and Polk, is that where the tree, I'm trying to remember the address.
710 Polk.
710 Polk. Excuse me. Have any of you gone out there to look at that?
I didn't know anything about it until you just mentioned it today.
Okay, I would give them the address. I would
Do a drive-by.
encourage them to go out there in the daytime and stand across the street and look down that alley and look at that tree and think, there's something wrong here, that we're requiring the adjoining property
Now,
owner.
see, you're prejudicing this by saying there's something wrong here.
Well, I'm
So I think you should-
saying.
I think you should just stop right now and just let us go look at it. I don't
Yeah,
know.
well, that's just fine, my view on it, but it's until you stand there and look at it, you don't, it's hard to make statements about it. And I've been out there and looked at it
I don't know
twice.
anything about it, other
Yeah.
than what you've
the
said.
the context helps.
The
in
context,
decision.
you have to understand the context of it, and it's just like, oh.
Well,
This is what we're talking about.
trees, it's interesting to me.
Trees are very-
The trees, are beautiful things, and you just, it's hard to say, oh, that tree is in a bad place, it needs to be removed.
Yes.
If it's healthy, it looks good, but there are times, and, you know, trees can become hazards just by the fact that they grow and they get big. And if you've got a moderate-sized tree that's not too far from your house, that's not a concern, but if it gets so big that, and I know one of my neighbors, when I lived outside of the city border, during a windstorm, had a tree come through their house, and fortunately nobody was injured, but it fell during the night and took out the bathroom right next to their master bedroom. You know, it was a tall fir tree, and just the fact that it was close to the house. You know, I mean, it was probably about 25 or 30 feet away from the house, 100 and some
Still got
foot
it.
fir tree. Just, and boy, when you see one of those things come down through a house, there's no mercy. So
There's no stopping
that
us.
particular tree was in a dangerous location because of its proximity to a house. If it had been in a park, or if it had been somewhere away from the building, it would have been no big deal.
Well, maybe the house was in a dangerous location vis-a-vis the tree, because the tree was probably there before the house was
And
built.
that's probably
So, you know, again,
But-
it's all about context, Charles.
Well, it is, and that's exactly my point, is it depends where those trees have to be. And, you know, the house I just bought, you know, it's got a gigantic tree in the backyard. Now, when I bought it, I saw it, I know it, I can live with it and everything, but the guy we bought it from, that house, that particular tree was a real source of aggravation for him, because when they bought the house, when they originally had the house built, it was a small tree.
Got it.
And he had lots of sun in his backyard. And you can see they had this very elaborate raised planter bed, and it had this whole area that was their garden. Well, that area gets no sunlight, no sun.
Shade lands.
And I guess he spent the last 8 or 10 years badgering the neighbor to try to cut the tree down because he had no sun back there. So, you know, it's like you say, the context, where it's at, the proximity to, and I know in Portland, there's two sides to the coin. The other side is that they actually have shade ordinances now to protect your sun rights, you know, so that you don't have a situation where somebody builds too close to your property, a big building that's going to block the sun.
Right.
And trees do the same thing over time. You know, that little tree that you planted back there when it was only 8 feet tall, when it gets to be 60 feet tall, it's an entirely different situation.
People seem to have selective memory about that.
Yeah, and
So,
to that end,
yeah. I think the other thing we included in your packet
yeah.
was we're going to kind of talk about the Oregon City street tree list. And so, you know, the one issue we've been dealing with is, you know, we started, once we instituted planter strips, we started at a 3-foot planter width, which is really about 2.5, because that includes the curve, the 6-inch curve. And we've had quite a few pop sidewalks as some of these older subdivisions, the trees are maturing. And when we started the subdivision process, we didn't have a street tree list. We kind of left it to the private side to put in trees, and we're finding quite a few pop sidewalks associated with that. Then we went to the larger 5-foot planter strips, so about 4.5. And we finally came out with a street tree list in 2001-ish. So now we're going back and really, you know, as we get more information about appropriate trees, planting procedures, standards, you know, we're going to start implementing those. But I think it was time to review the street tree list.
So you're eliminating the problematic trees off the list?
Trying to, yeah. Trying to identify those, or if there are other ones that are more appropriate for certain planter widths. You know, I think I think that this was probably a discussion to TSP about trying to get a little bit wider planter strip even within that local street right-of-way cross-section. We're also instituting root barriers as a standard to try and push those roots down a little bit deeper and under, instead of coming up and really just popping those sidewalks pretty quick.
Can I ask you a specific question? So is it a specific species of the Norway maple? Because I know that
Appears to
when
be.
we were doing a lot of subdivisions, people would pick the sunset.
Sunset maple's causing problems, yeah.
And
Mhm.
you know,
Even
these were
in the
fairly,
4.5 footers already.
the 4.5-foot planter
Yeah,
strips?
they're popping.
Because I mean,
Is that right?
we based that decision on what was the best
Yeah,
information we
best
had
information
at the time. Because
Yeah.
I still think a sunset crimson Norway maple is it's a gorgeous tree.
I don't
Yeah, it is.
disagree, yeah, but I
And some of
think,
them are in great shape, but the roots are going pow.
Is it because, it might be because of our soil?
And it could be because of the clay soils.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
if they can't go down, which is what they're supposed to do, they go like, as I know with my pear trees.
Mhm.
They're doing that.
Right.
Well, another thing there is, and I was told that in this area that we just bought into, is that it has a lot to do with the tree being planted deep enough to begin with.
Yeah.
Mhm.
If they're not planted deep enough to begin with, then they're just gonna go out like that.
Well, they're gonna seek water.
And so,
Yeah.
most of the trees on our street were not planted deep enough, and you can see all the sidewalks are all, you know.
I think it's a combination of both correct tree selection as well as correct planting. I know we've run into certain situations where literally there was rock left in the hole, you know, the bottom base rock from the core of the street. You know, as they came in with the pit. Well, of course, you know, so we had these guys go in and dig it, but, you know, for every one we catch,
Right.
how many did we miss along the way? So that's,
Probably.
yeah, they just dumped the rock over because they had, you know, extra, space, so we didn't know what to do with it instead of haul it away. So, you know, really focusing in on our engineering's design standards for how to appropriately amend and plant.
And so people are blaming it on the tree, when it's really not.
Yeah.
Right.
It's really not the tree's fault.
Yeah.
It's how, like you say, they weren't planted deep enough. And
Well, and the other thing is that a lot of the soil in the Oregon City area is very, very rocky and hard
Yeah.
clay.
Yeah.
So it depends on the soil you're putting it
Yeah.
in too.
Yeah, everything up on top is a lot of clay up
Yeah,
here.
you get a lot of that hard clay.
we amended some of the soil in the holes that we dug like 20 years ago, but I mean, we hit hard pan at about 4.5 feet.
Right.
And we could not dig any further.
Yeah, when I first moved into my place, my wife and I decided every year we'd buy a Christmas tree, a living Christmas tree root ball, and we'd go out and plant it after Christmas was passed. First time I dug a hole, I thought, what is this brick?
It's brick.
It's like digging through brick.
It's brick.
Get up the pitch.
It's unbelievable.
Axe, yeah.
I spent a whole day digging a hole for a tree out there.
Yeah, we stopped doing that after we did it once, and we now plant them out on my in-laws' farm
Yeah.
instead, because at least we can hit a 5-foot hole without killing
I
ourselves.
think I did about 8 of them before I gave up.
So.
I think this brings up a good point as well, or a question I have. You know, with so many really narrow planting strips in the city, will the new street tree code allow for exceptions where, you know, it's 2-foot wide strip, planter strip,
It's
this isn't a
useless.
good place for a tree?
Right.
Can an exception be made by planting a tree in the front yard?
Yes.
You know?
Yes, we'll do that, especially on these narrower ones where there's just no reason, after you've gone in, replace the sidewalk, to try and stick another one in there. So we'll work with them to get some type of a planting easement and let them put it in the front yard somewhere, depending on, you know, what you typically have, you know, let's just say, typical street right-of-way is 53 feet across. And then you usually have a 5 to 10 foot public utility easement behind that. So if there are no utilities in there, that really dictates where in that front yard we allow you to replace it. But yes, we do that. If that's not possible, we try to work with them to find another location to plant. But yeah, we don't, on some of these, there's just really no reason to put them back. You'd be back in the same situation very quickly.
What Eric has done is, he found these documents that are in the back of your packet from Lake Oswego. 2 really great documents that I would like to steal and amend. But one is the right tree in the right place document, which is a 25-page document that talks about not only what the right tree is for the right planting area, but also has great illustrations, has discussion about the benefits of trees, tells people how to select a tree, and then in the actual chart area, there's a lot more visual and graphic information than a typical street tree would have, because it actually shows the shape of the tree when it's mature, the mature size and the mature height, which is simple to read because it doesn't provide a range of growth. It says what the typical mature range is, which gives people a better idea of how big that tree could ultimately get in the planter strip. And it also includes, I believe this is right, it also includes native trees, but it doesn't define native trees or call them out specifically. And one of the things that we heard from the Natural Resources Committee was that native trees, if they're allowed in your street tree list, could be called out separately. Some of those are going to be fairly small, like native dogwoods. Some are actually, majority of native trees are going to grow to be pretty big, so they're going to be suitable for a much larger planting area, which our minimum planter strip width today is 4.5 feet, so a lot of native trees aren't going to be appropriate within that width of planter strip. Yeah. But it's nice to provide options.
I think one of the really great things about this Lake Oswego list is that it specifically called out which ones are okay underneath utility lines. So, 30, 40 years down the road, you're not having to deal with the utility pruning, where they're gutting a great tree because the utility lines need to go through. So.
I think another thing that we've been trying to do is work with our Public Works Department on alternatives when we get sidewalks cracking. Can we go to a different material rather than just pouring the concrete? We'll work with property owners to kind of bring the sidewalk out and around to try and save that tree. So those are really the two options that we have, in terms of trying to save a tree that has a root issue. You really, those are the two we can identify. The alternative material and rerouting.
Well, we have that on Rylance with the big oak tree in the public right-of-way that's next to the Holmes house. They were able to do something with the sidewalk to make it come out and around it so that the tree can be preserved, because it's big.
And still meet our minimum ADA requirements for sidewalk width.
Is it always this cold in here?
No,
it's chilly in here. I'm going to go put my coat on here in a minute, because whatever it is blowing right down on top of me.
I think another part of, hopefully, if we can create a document similar to this, this year we're going to apply for the Tree City USA designation. And I think education is, to me, it's one of the areas we really need to focus and start on and get that community buy-in and education component if we want to move forward with other regulatory
I think
measures.
if you did it right, you'd have a great response from the public, because these sidewalks can kill you. Because of being popped. They really are, and they're a liability problem, too. Suits and stuff like this.
This document in the very back, which is the one from the city of Gresham, is really nicely done because it's not providing a ton of information, but it's talking in plain language about how to go about maintaining and pruning and removing a street tree. And it has good illustrations and a lot of white space on the pages, which is nice. The letters are nice and big. And that's something that we haven't done with our guide. Our guide is single-spaced and very small letters and no illustrations.
Yeah.
So, this is something that I'd like to use to redo ours.
It's those little things that add up that make the difference.
Yeah.
I've used a little bit.
Before I forget, one of the things I'd like to see you guys come back with is a public benefit for the historical tree. What benefit does the historical tree have for the general public? And I think if that was put in there and incorporated into the documentation that goes to the commission, that's another reason for it being approved, is the public benefit factor.
Well, this thing here talks about the street tree 101. Says, why are street trees a big deal?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
I think all the reasons that they have here
Sure.
are reasons why people should be supporting street trees.
Sure.
They-
sure.
We have, let's even use global warming, cuts down on that heat.
Yeah,
Why do you have your coat on?
Because
Global warming.
Yeah. No, because it's global warming in this room.
No, that's global cooling.
The ice age is coming to City Hall right now.
It's here.
faster than you think.
So I think that'd be another product that hopefully we'll see
Public
pretty soon,
benefit
is to
industry, that's a good
update.
idea.
Yeah.
It's a great idea.
So your plan would be to do some rewrite and come back with a draft for review at some point?
There's one other factor too, and that's the administration of this thing. Keep it simple, because these things can be a can of worms.
Yeah, Gresham has what they call a free type 1 street tree permit. Essentially, that's what we do today. It's free. It's over the counter. They've got to propose a replacement tree, but we're already using the Portland street tree list because it starts out at 2.5 feet and has trees that are suitable then in that area. And we also are looking at the Gresham list. But our current street tree list was adopted by ordinance, I found out. So technically, it needs to be amended by ordinance. So that's what.
Or we may remove it from being adopted via ordinance and we'll go to more of like a design standard. that can
Yeah,
be changed.
put it in the specifications document
Rather
instead.
than codify it,
Yeah.
just for ease of using.
Can I ask a question in terms of invasive trees that are on noxious plant lists, things like that? Again, I think going back to Lake Oswego, they recently adopted some type of policy. We're looking into it to kind of free up the process, allowing homeowners to remove invasive trees with less kind of hassle.
Regulatory.
Is that something that can be considered? Or?
We can certainly, I don't have a problem with that, yeah, I can't think of trying to think of if we run into, mostly we're dealing with pop sidewalks or diseased trees.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
That really is.
Ours has mostly been, make sure we're not putting in any type of invasive or obnoxious tree off of our list, which maybe is something we need to look at as well, make sure that that's accurate.
Yeah, I think, if you get a tree of heaven or empress trees, these trees that grow incredibly fast and produce a ton of seed. And, if we're just allowing these to grow and proliferate while also spending all of these resources trying to keep our natural areas, in check.
Doing more harm than
Seems
good.
like supporting removing those, that would be something
I
to
don't think
explore.
people are planting tree of heaven on purpose. I think,
Right.
No, it's just a matter of not removing it when.
yeah, because they don't know what it is.
Right.
Well, I'm not sure about this, but I thought the Norway maple was potentially listed as an invasive in Portland. So, yeah, that's one now where you're like, oh.
That's what we picked.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, once again, why it's time to have a look at this and really kind of focus in on what's appropriate, what's going to work.
Keep it simple.
If people could plant, I mean, I don't have the space, but let's say I had enough room, I could plant a sunset red maple on my property, but I wouldn't put it in a parking strip.
Sure.
I mean, as long as you have plenty of room. Because like I said, matter of fact, coming through, there's several in Ashland, and I mean, they're starting to, that sunset color. I mean, there was that, but they weren't in parking strips. They're orders.
I think it's just to try and get ahead of this because we, 15 years in, we've realized it's a major issue, not only for the city, but for the property owners. So what can we do to
It's amazing when trees, people either really love them or they hate them. I was working with a property owner in Portland, and we were going to be planting some trees in front of that particular business. I won't say which business it is, but the reason that the CEO gave me that they didn't want the trees is that trees drop leaves, and he did not want leaves on his sidewalk. And I
Yeah.
said, well, it's not really your sidewalk, it's the public sidewalk. We planted a tree in front of their, like, not in front, but off to the side of it, because the city told us we had to.
And I think there'll always be that tension, you know, because it butts their property and they use it.
Yeah.
They kind of, so it's like an extension of the private yard, yet at the same time, immediately on the other side of that, or actually, it is part of the public realm. And therefore, it goes back to what he was saying, what is the public benefit? And, you know, we've got stated street tree purpose, which is tree-lined streets. You know, and it's like, it's difficult to get tree-lined streets when your planter strips are only
Yeah.
3.5 feet wide, you know.
And then you
Yeah.
move a space shuttle through your community and cut down 4,000.
Is that
I thought
right?
that was a little bizarre in LA. I said, really?
No, yeah.
To me, they should have taken the shuttles.
4,000?
Were they real or were they the plastic ones?
So what can we do to get more trees in parking lots? Because, you know, whenever it gets really hot, guess where everybody parks?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think,
That hit the national news, guys.
We need to have
You
less
would've
asphalt
thought there
in
was a
parking
better
lots.
way.
You think so, wouldn't you?
Put that there.
we did a
You get the thing up in the air.
Like a helicopter.
Based
Yeah.
on the last fiscal year, it was 10, we almost hit it, 10 acres of new impervious in
10
one
acres,
fiscal
yeah,
year.
good.
Because we just, of new impervious surface, yeah. Based on a fairly slow development year. But, you know, that's, and so the stormwater standards and the criteria for reporting those is being ratcheted up now, so. we'll see.
I know in the summertime, in Fred Meyer, I park, Hilltop Fred Meyer, I park in the back of their lot, because that's where all
All the trees are on
And
the
it
property
makes
line.
so much difference
Yep.
getting in your car.
But-
I don't mind if I have to walk across the parking lot, but
I think the Safeway site, the new Safeway site, should be a good indicator of how the current parking lot landscaping standards are working, because they are at the current code, which
it's
is,
so small.
well, actually, some of their strips are wider than the
I'm
minimum.
talking about the interior
Oh,
parking lot. I
it's
ca-
10%.
Yeah, I was looking at the number of trees and I thought, boy, it's gonna be a long time before these suckers grow up. Does it make any
Yeah.
difference?
Do you have a list of neighborhoods where the sidewalks are buckling and in bad repair?
Yeah, we've
Is that
gone.
a survey?
We've gone and met with most of the, well, we've met with every neighborhood association.
Well, I think,
Did we miss
we met with 6.
6?
So are those all the new subdivisions out?
No, a lot of them, some of the older ones that
Barclay
that were
Hills.
having problems where we noticed, because we actually had an intern, Public Works had an
Those new-
intern
that's
do
the
a sidewalk
subdivision down
inventory,
there's having problems.
and we have very good data, though it's a little bit dated, in terms of sidewalk quality, and from good to, medium to hazardous. And so we targeted those neighborhoods, both because we had that information, but we were starting to get a lot of calls, and what can we do to try and help
Golf course names.
in terms of setting up, trying to coordinate multiple property owners to try and get some economies of scale in the removal and replacement of the sidewalk as well as the street trees. What's the one am I drawing like Newell?
Barclay Hills.
Barclay Hills.
Yeah.
Was
But you're talking about the
big
new subdivision down Barclay Hills Drive that goes down into,
one. Yeah.
Yeah, they had a lot of problems initially, and then the reason that the sidewalk survey was done was to show compliance with ADA reporting, so that's what drives a lot of these removals, is the liability associated with sidewalk repair, which is driven by the ADA.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting, and Denise had a comment about the building owner having resistance to planting the tree on their property, and that's one thing that has changed a lot over probably the last 15 or 20 years, is that people are so concerned about the liability that they're making decisions based on that rather than what actually may be the best solution. They're driving their decisions based on potential liabilities instead.
It's
Kind of
a real
an
issue.
unfortunate situation, because if you cancel out planting trees just because you're worried about people slipping on wet leaves, that's not the best criteria to be using.
It's the same issue of people in our community who don't take the snow off. I mean, there's requirement that, if it snows, you get out there and you keep your walks clear.
Right.
Very few people do it around here.
But there's that whole element of liability that I think over the last 20 years or so has exploded into a much
Yeah,
bigger factor in decision making.
you're right, Charles, and I think it has driven a lot of this, unfortunately.
Tony, that expense of replacement of sidewalk is borne by the property owner, right?
Mhm. Yeah, and they don't want to have to do it again in 5 years.
Well,
So,
and you used to
yeah.
be able to, it was a fairly simple fix if you just made a little
Grind it.
ramp transition with some asphalt or something
Mhm.
like that, but now that doesn't comply with ADA.
Right.
Mhm. Right.
So, yeah, we try to get it, if it's a small enough lip, we'll try and grind it. But, you're just delaying the issue.
Mhm.
And it'd be nice if you could just use pavers or something like that.
And that's what we're trying to go to, that'll move a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the other aspect of it from the tree maintenance side is, you can prune the root, but will the tree survive the root
Right.
pruning?
Right.
And, because if you remove a large roof on this side, all of a sudden you've destabilized the tree, and the next good wind might blow it over. So that has to be done under the supervision of a trained arborist as well. And in some case, and we don't do that today. We don't have a root pruning step in the sidewalk inspection process. If your sidewalk is lifting ½ inch or more, you can get a tree removal permit based on just the lip itself. Yeah. Yeah. All right,
All right.
thanks.
I think that's it.
Appreciate it.
All right.
So we'll work on some stuff.
We'll look forward to seeing some new stuff. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'll take 2 seconds and move chairs.
Oh, I'll be happy to do this, guys, because
We'll take them with us.
Wherever the air was, it was coming right down on the top of my head, and I got up and